A lone man becomes the unlikely hero of a broken neighborhood, inspiring hope and unity. But when his story is told, a secret from his past threatens to change everything. Marcos adjusted his work apron, the fabric frayed from years of wear, and placed the tray of freshly baked bread onto the counter. The early morning light filtered through the cracked window pane of the neighborhood bakery, casting long shadows on the peeling walls. It was another day in the Barrio Santo, a place he had called home his entire life. Despite its decay, Marcos found comfort in its routines, helping his elderly mother with errands, fixing broken fences for neighbors, and making sure little Valentina had her favorite candy whenever she stopped by the bakery. The barrio, however, was no longer the place of innocent childhood games and warm community gatherings. Over the years, the shadow of violence had crept into every corner. Gang activity, once distant rumors, had become a daily threat. At the heart of this transformation was Tomas, the ruthless leader of the Los Lobos gang. Marcos, like many others, knew better than to draw unnecessary attention from them. "Marcos!" A sweet, high-pitched voice broke his thoughts. Valentina, clutching her school books to her chest, peeked through the door. Her wide smile lit up the dim room. "Morning, Princesa," Marcos greeted her warmly, handing her a lollipop. Her laughter echoed as she waved goodbye, hurrying off to school. For a moment, the world felt normal again. The tranquility shattered when the bakery door swung open with force. In walked Tomas, his imposing frame and piercing eyes sucking the air out of the room. His presence was magnetic, terrifying. He scanned the space, his lips curling into a smirk when his gaze landed on Marcos. "Hey, you're the guy who fixes things for everyone, right?" Tomas's voice was casual, but the undertone carried weight. "Yes," Marcos replied cautiously, wiping his hands on his apron. "Good, you're a useful guy." Tomas took a step closer, his voice lowering. "Useful people stay safe in this neighborhood. You understand, don't you?" Marcos nodded, his throat dry. Satisfied, Tomas turned and left as abruptly as he'd arrived, his footsteps fading into the bustling streets. Marcos let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands trembled slightly as he leaned against the counter. Outside, life carried on as if nothing had happened. Children played, vendors shouted their wares, and the scent of street food filled the air. Yet for Marcos, the world felt heavier now. Tomas's words lingered like a storm cloud, a quiet warning that trouble was watching. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Marcos locked the bakery door and began his walk home. His thoughts churned, the weight of responsibility for his mother, his neighbors, and the fragile stability of his life pressed down on him. He didn't want to attract attention, but he knew in his heart that avoiding conflict in Barrio Santo was like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. The streets grew darker, the familiar corners of the barrio casting longer, more menacing shadows. Marcos quickened his pace, his senses heightened. Tomas's smirk replayed in his mind, a silent declaration. "You're already on my radar." The fading sunlight painted the walls of the alleyway in a muted orange as Marcos walked briskly, his mind preoccupied with the weight of another long day at work. The sounds of the city, car horns, distant chatter, and the occasional barking dog were muffled in the narrow passage he had chosen as a shortcut. It wasn't the safest route, but it was the quickest way home. As he turned a corner, the air seemed to shift, heavy with an unsettling silence. Marcos slowed his pace, instinctively scanning his surroundings. The alley was deserted, save for the faint outline of three figures standing at the far end. Their postures were tense, their presence deliberate. "Marcos!" a voice called, sharp and cutting through the quiet. Tomas stepped forward, his lean frame illuminated by a flickering street lamp above. Behind him, two men lingered, their faces partially obscured but their intent clear. Marcos stopped in his tracks, his breath catching. He recognized Tomas immediately. The man was notorious in the neighborhood, a self-proclaimed leader who thrived on intimidation and fear. The other two were his loyal followers, shadows that echoed his every move. "What do you want, Tomas?" Marcos asked, keeping his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. Tomas smirked, the kind of grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I want answers," he said, his voice low but menacing. "The cops have been sniffing around, asking questions they shouldn't, and I've got a feeling you had something to do with it." Marcos frowned, confusion mingling with apprehension. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied. "I don't deal with the police, you know that." "Don't play dumb," Tomas snapped, his voice rising. He took another step closer, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. You think I don't notice you keeping your head down, pretending to be better than the rest of us? You've been stirring up trouble, Marcos, and I don't like it. Marcos raised his hands in a placating gesture, his heart pounding. I'm just trying to live my life. Whatever's happening with the police, it has nothing to do with me. Tomas's eyes narrowed, his smirk vanishing. He turned slightly, exchanging a glance with one of his men. That was the only warning Marcos had before the first punch landed. Pain exploded across his cheek, and he stumbled back, his vision swimming. Another blow followed, this time to his ribs, forcing the air from his lungs. Marcos raised his arms defensively, but the strikes kept coming, relentless and unyielding. Enough, Tomas barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The blows stopped, leaving Marcos gasping and hunched over, his body trembling with the effort to stay upright. He looked up, blood trickling from his split lip, and met Tomas's cold gaze. I tried to be civil, Tomas said, his tone almost conversational. But now, you're going to learn what happens to people who cross me. Marcos's chest heaved as he struggled to find his voice. I didn't do anything, he managed, his words slurred. I'm not your enemy. Tomas leaned in close, his breath hot against Marcos's ear. You are now, he whispered. Then, with a sharp nod, he stepped back, signaling his men. They shoved Marcos roughly against the wall before retreating, their laughter echoing as they disappeared into the shadows. Marcos slid to the ground, his back against the cold brick, the world spinning around him. The distant hum of the city returned, indifferent to his pain. For a moment, he stayed there, his mind racing. This wasn't just an attack, it was a warning. And deep down, he knew it wouldn't be the last. Valentina sat by the cracked window, her knees drawn to her chest, watching the street below with bated breath. The scene was chaotic. A group of men surrounded Marcos, their voices rising in anger. The fading sunlight cast long shadows, exaggerating the menace in their postures. She could feel her heart racing, each beat louder than the threats echoing below. She had heard of Marcos before, a quiet presence in the neighborhood, someone who kept to himself. But now, seeing him cornered, his face bruised and his breath labored, Valentina felt an unexpected surge of indignation. The metallic taste of fear coated her tongue, but something deeper stirred, a refusal to let violence define their lives. For a moment she hesitated. What could she do? She was just a child, and they were armed with cruelty and power. But then she remembered her mother's voice. Sometimes bravery isn't about being unafraid. It's about doing what's right, despite the fear. Valentina pushed open the window, the rusty hinges screeching. She leaned out, clutching the sill so tightly her knuckles turned white. Below, one of the men turned, his eyes narrowing as he spotted her. She swallowed hard, but her voice broke through the thick evening air like a lightning strike. The police are coming, she shouted, her words carrying a conviction that surprised even her. The reaction was immediate. The men exchanged panicked glances, their bravado faltering. One of them muttered, "Let's go," before they scattered like leaves in the wind. Marcos, clutching his side, used the distraction to stumble to his feet. He glanced up at Valentina, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Her courage had bought him a precious moment, and he wasn't about to waste it. Valentina darted from the window and rushed outside, her bare feet skimming the pavement. By the time she reached Marcos, he was leaning heavily against a wall, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll be fine," he managed, though the pain in his voice betrayed the truth. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. "That was brave, what you did," Valentina shrugged, though her hands still shook. "Someone had to do something." Marcos nodded, a spark of determination igniting in his weary eyes. He realized then that this girl, this fearless, defiant girl, needed his protection as much as he now needed hers. The two stood in silence as the first stars began to pierce the night sky. For the first time in a long time, Marcos felt a flicker of hope. Marcos sat at the edge of his worn-out sofa, the dim light from a flickering lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His fingers traced the faint lines of his bandaged arm, each stroke a reminder of the chaotic night that could have been his last. The memory of Valentina pulling him from the brink replayed endlessly in his mind. Her determination, her unwavering resolve, it had shaken something deep within him. She had risked everything to save him. And for what? A man who had spent so long pretending he didn't care about anyone or anything. He exhaled sharply, leaning back into the creaking cushions. Outside, the muffled sounds of the neighborhood carried on, a dog barking, distant laughter, a car engine revving. But to Marcos, it all felt muted, distant, as if the world had turned its back on him. His thoughts drifted to the gang that had attacked him. Their faces were etched in his memory, especially Tomas, the one who had led the charge. The humiliation Tomas had endured when Valentina intervened would not be forgotten. Marcos knew men like him too well, pride wounded, rage brewing. Tomas wouldn't just let this go, he would return, and the next time, it wouldn't just be a warning. Marcos ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. How had it come to this? How had his neighborhood, his home, fallen so far into chaos that survival meant looking over your shoulder at every turn? And now, with Valentina caught in the crossfire, things felt different. For years, he had kept his head down, avoiding trouble. But this was something else. Valentina had stepped into danger without hesitation, showing more courage in a single moment than he had in a lifetime. He stood, pacing the small room, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. The scar on his arm wasn't the only one reopening tonight. His mind revisited old wounds, the kind that never truly heal. He thought of the choices he had made, the times he had chosen to turn away instead of stand up. But now the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about him anymore. Valentina's face flashed in his mind, her sharp gaze, her fierce determination. He owed her more than gratitude. He owed her action. If he didn't do something, if he didn't protect her and the people who still had hope in this crumbling neighborhood, what kind of man would he be? As the night deepened, Marcos made his decision. The gangs had ruled these streets for too long, and if they thought he was just another pawn in their game, they were wrong. This time he wouldn't run. This time he would fight back. Far away, in a darkened room, Tomas nursed his bruises, his jaw clenched in fury. "He'll regret it," Tomas hissed to his crew. His mind raced with plans for revenge, something that would crush Marcos completely. The neighborhood didn't know it yet, but war was brewing. The air in the neighborhood had grown heavier, an almost tangible weight of fear and uncertainty settling over the streets. Tomas, the gang leader, was making his presence known again, prowling the alleyways with his enforcers. His voice boomed as he shouted at a corner store owner who had dared to speak out, his threats echoing against the worn brick walls. The message was clear. Anyone challenging his authority would face consequences. Tomas's methods were calculated. He didn't need to strike everyone, just a few strategic examples. One evening, he marched up to Don Luis, an elderly man who often sat on his porch, observing the world with weary eyes. "I hear you've been talking," Tomas hissed, leaning close. The sound of a glass bottle shattering on the ground punctuated his threat. From behind closed curtains, neighbors watched in silence, their fear sealing their lips. Meanwhile, Marcos was restless. He moved from house to house, knocking softly on doors, pleading with his neighbors. "We can't let him control us like this," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "If we stand together, he can't intimidate us all." Yet, door after door, the responses were the same: shaken heads, murmurs of regret, and the occasional whispered warning to be careful. "I have a family, Marcos," one man said, glancing nervously at the street before closing the door. "I can't risk it." Marcos sighed deeply as he walked away, frustration and determination mingling in his chest. He knew they were scared. He was too. But he also knew that fear was what Tomas thrived on. If no one stood up, the neighborhood would remain shackled to his reign of terror. In the midst of this tension, Valentina sat in her small room, her fingers moving quickly over the pages of a worn notebook. She had taken to writing stories, weaving tales of bravery she wished to see in the people around her. Marcos, in particular, had become a central figure in her narratives. To her, he was the embodiment of courage, a beacon in a neighborhood drowning in shadows. She scribbled furiously, the dim light of her desk lamp illuminating the determined set of her face. In her stories, Marcos's words carried power, sparking a revolution among the residents. In her stories, fear was not the final word. These tales were her way of coping, of finding hope amidst the despair. One day, she watched from her window as Marcos stood at the corner, speaking to a small group of neighbors who had dared to listen. Though their numbers were few, Valentina saw something remarkable, a flicker of defiance in their postures. It was enough to inspire another story, this time about small sparks igniting a wildfire. But outside her window, the reality was harsher. Tomas's grip on the neighborhood was tightening. People who had once walked freely now hurried, heads down, avoiding his gaze. Even the streets seemed quieter, as if holding their breath. Valentina closed her notebook and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. She wondered if the courage she wrote about could ever materialize. Yet as she glanced back at the corner, where Marcos's voice carried on, she allowed herself a sliver of hope. For now, tension reigned. But under its surface, something was stirring. The message arrived just after dusk, carried by the metallic click of a penknife left outside Marcos's door. The blade gleamed under the dim light, impaling a folded note. With trembling hands, Marcos unfolded it to reveal scrawled words that sent a chill down his spine. "Come find her, or I will." Valentina's name wasn't on the paper, but Marcos knew. His mind raced as he pieced together fragments of the day, her quiet defiance, her role in foiling their previous attack. She had unknowingly painted a target on herself, and now Tomas had her. Somewhere across town, Valentina stood frozen in a shadowy warehouse. Tomas leaned casually against a steel beam, his piercing eyes scrutinizing her every move. His presence exuded an unsettling calm, like a predator savoring the inevitability of its catch. "I thought you liked games, Valentina," Tomas said, his voice a soft taunt that echoed off the cavernous walls. "Consider this, a more exciting one." She glared at him, her hands bound tightly behind her back. "You'll regret this," he chuckled. "Oh, I'm counting on it." Tomas wasn't interested in her words. She was merely a tool, a chess piece to lure Marcos into his trap. Every detail was meticulously planned: location, timing, even the ominous note. All he needed now was for Marcos to play his part. Marcos's heart pounded as he hurriedly searched his small apartment for anything useful. A wrench, a flashlight, anything that could double as a weapon. His breath came in short, panicked bursts as the weight of Tomas's message settled over him. He had seen firsthand what Tomas was capable of. The mere thought of Valentina in his hands filled him with dread. Outside, the streets were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt alive. Marcos moved quickly, his mind replaying Valentina's laugh, her stubborn determination, and the way she had always stood by him. He couldn't lose her. Not now. Not like this. Back at the warehouse, Tomas sent a final taunting text. The phone buzzed in Marcos's pocket, its glow briefly illuminating his strained face. He glanced down at the screen. "Tick-tock, Marcos. Time's running out." Valentina shifted uncomfortably, her wrists raw from the rope binding them. She strained to listen, hoping for any sound that might indicate rescue. But all she could hear was the drip of water and the faint hum of machinery. "You think he'll come?" Tomas asked, his tone light but laced with menace. Valentina didn't answer, her silence her only weapon. Inside, though, she was terrified. Not for herself, but for Marcos. She knew he wouldn't hesitate to run into danger for her, and that thought made her resolve even stronger. Somewhere in the distance, Marcos began to run. The dim light of the evening sun painted long shadows across the street as Marcos stood in the center of the neighborhood square, his resolve etched on his face. The once bustling community had grown quiet, suffocated by the fear that Tomas and his gang imposed. Marcos knew the weight of his decision. This wasn't just about him, it was about all of them. And if they were going to stand a chance, he couldn't do it alone. "We've been silent for too long," Marcos began, his voice steady yet filled with urgency. A small group of neighbors gathered, their faces a mix of apprehension and curiosity. "Tomas and his men think they own this place, but we're the ones who live here. We're the ones who built this community. It's time we take it back." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Old Mr. Raphael, who had seen the neighborhood's glory days, stepped forward, his cane tapping against the cracked pavement. "Marcos," Raphael said, his tone heavy with doubt. "Fighting them could make things worse. They have guns, numbers. What do we have?" Marcos clenched his fists, frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "We have each other," he replied, meeting Raphael's gaze. "Tomas may have weapons, but we have something stronger, a reason to fight. They took Valentina. If we don't act now, who's next? What will we become if we keep hiding?" The mention of Valentina drew a collective gasp from the crowd. Valentina, beloved by everyone, was the heart of the community, a symbol of resilience and kindness. Her abduction was a blow that no one could ignore. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit room on the outskirts of the neighborhood, Valentina sat on a rickety chair, her hands bound, but her spirit unbroken. Tomas leaned casually against the wall, his cold eyes scanning her like a predator assessing its prey. "You think Marcos will come for you?" Tomas sneered, lighting a cigarette. "He's nothing, just another fool who doesn't know his place." Valentina's gaze didn't waver. She held on to the one thing Tomas could never break: hope. "Marcos isn't alone," she said softly, her voice steady despite the knot of fear in her chest. "You underestimate him, and that will be your mistake." Tomas laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the room. But beneath his bravado, cracks were beginning to show. In the shadows of his gang, whispers of dissent had started to spread. Some questioned his obsession with Valentina. Others doubted his leadership altogether. The fractures within his ranks, though subtle, were growing deeper with every reckless decision he made. Back in the square, Marcos felt the tide begin to shift. As more neighbors stepped forward, volunteering their support, a faint glimmer of unity began to shine. They weren't soldiers, but they were people with something worth protecting. For the first time in months, the fear that had gripped them so tightly began to loosen. "This isn't just about me or Valentina," Marcos said, his voice rising with conviction. "It's about all of us. Together we can take back our home." As the group began to strategize, a sense of purpose filled the air. The battle ahead would be far from easy, but Marcos was no longer standing alone. The central square buzzed with tense anticipation. The soft glow of streetlights illuminated the faces of neighbors who had gathered, united by a single purpose. At the forefront stood Marcos, his figure steady despite the weight of what was about to unfold. Behind him, an eclectic mix of townsfolk clutched makeshift weapons: wooden sticks, iron rods, even garden tools. Their collective fear was palpable, but so was their determination. Across from them, Tomas leaned casually against a bench, his gang fanned out behind him like a wall of menace. Their laughter echoed through the square, cold and mocking. Tomas's eyes narrowed as he scanned the crowd, his lips curling into a sneer. "Well, well," he drawled, "the sheep think they can fight the wolves." Marcos stepped forward. "This is where it ends, Tomas. Your days of terrorizing this town are over." His voice carried a clarity that seemed to cut through the night air. A ripple of courage spread among the crowd. Tomas pushed off the bench, sauntering closer. "You think your little army can stop me?" His words oozed disdain, but there was a flicker of unease in his posture. He hadn't expected such a turnout. For a moment, there was silence. Then an elderly man took a step forward. "We've had enough," he said firmly, raising his walking stick. Others murmured in agreement, and soon the crowd surged forward, their collective voice rising against the oppressive weight of Tomas and his gang. The gang tensed, and for a heartbeat, it seemed as though chaos might erupt. Marcos's eyes darted across the scene, searching desperately. Somewhere amidst this standoff was Valentina, her safety his paramount concern. He spotted her through the narrow gap between two gang members, bound but unharmed, her wide eyes locking onto his. She tried to say something, but her voice was muffled by the cloth gag. A young man from the town shouted, "They have Valentina!" The crowd bristled with fury. Emboldened, Marcos lunged forward, but Tomas raised his hand, signaling his men to block the charge. A scuffle broke out as townsfolk and gang members collided, the square devolving into a chaotic swirl of movement. Marcos fought his way toward Valentina, his mind singularly focused. The gang's members were strong, but the townsfolk fought with the desperation of people defending their homes. Cries of defiance echoed as the townspeople surged forward, creating openings in the gang's defenses. Marcos reached Valentina and worked quickly to untie her bonds. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands trembling as they worked on the knots. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "but it's not safe. Tomas won't stop." Freed, Valentina clung to him briefly before Marcos pushed her toward a group of neighbors. "Take her to safety," he ordered, and they nodded, guiding her away. Across the square, Tomas's fury boiled over. He shoved one of his own men aside, storming toward Marcos. "You think this changes anything?" he roared, his voice a mixture of rage and desperation. "You think you've won?" Marcos turned to face him, his chest heaving. "This isn't about winning, Tomas. It's about ending your hold over this town." Tomas moved fast, pulling a knife from his waistband. The blade gleamed under the flickering lights as he lunged at Marcos. The crowd gasped, some shouting warnings, but it was too late. Tomas's attack came with the precision of someone who had fought countless times before. Marcos barely managed to sidestep the knife grazing his arm. Pain shot through him, but he stayed focused, grappling with Tomas to keep the weapon at bay. They tumbled to the ground, rolling amidst the dirt and debris of the square. The townsfolk closed in, some rushing to pull gang members away while others cried out for Marcos. Pinned beneath Tomas, Marcos's strength began to wane. The gang leader grinned, pressing the knife closer. "You should have stayed quiet, Marcos," he hissed. But then, out of the corner of his eye, Marcos saw a piece of shattered wood within reach. Summoning his last reserves of strength, he twisted free and grabbed it, striking Tomas hard across the face. Tomas recoiled, blood dripping from his temple. Staggering to his feet, Marcos planted himself firmly, chest heaving. Tomas stayed on the ground, dazed but glaring, his grip on the knife loosening. The square had quieted, the gang realizing their leader was no longer untouchable. Marcos pointed at him. "Leave," he said, his voice trembling but firm, "and don't come back." For a moment, it seemed Tomas might argue, but the strength of the crowd, now standing behind Marcos, was undeniable. Defeated and humiliated, Tomas spat on the ground before signaling his men to retreat. As they disappeared into the shadows, the crowd erupted in cheers. Marcos, bloodied and exhausted, allowed himself a small, weary smile. He turned to see Valentina, safe and surrounded by neighbors. Relief washed over him, but he knew this victory was just the beginning of rebuilding their town. The air was thick with tension as Tomas's once loyal gang members surrounded him, their expressions a mix of resentment and defiance. For years, his iron fist had ruled the streets, but cracks in his authority had grown deeper with every mistake. Now, in the dim light of an abandoned warehouse, it was clear. His power was crumbling. "You're done, Tomas," muttered Ricardo, one of his closest allies. His voice carried a weight that silenced the whispers among the group. "We've followed you into nothing but trouble. Look around, we're losing everything." Tomas clenched his fists, his pride refusing to yield even as the walls of loyalty collapsed around him. "You think you can survive without me? You owe me everything." His voice, once commanding, now trembled with desperation. Ricardo stepped forward, his stance firm. "Not anymore." With a single nod, others moved to block Tomas's path. Their unified movement was an unmistakable sign of rebellion. The weight of betrayal settled on Tomas's shoulders as he realized he no longer commanded respect or fear. Meanwhile, outside the warehouse, the faint sound of sirens grew louder, piercing the silence of the tense night. Valentina's mother, driven by a desperate need to protect her daughter, had called the police after overhearing rumors of the gang's latest confrontation. The echo of authority in those approaching sirens brought a new layer of tension to the scene. Inside, Tomas looked around at the faces he had once considered allies. The realization hit him like a blow. He was alone. His arrogance had blinded him to the crumbling foundation of his empire, and now even those he trusted had turned against him. His attempts to rally them with threats and promises fell on deaf ears. The doors to the warehouse burst open, and a flood of officers swarmed the space, weapons drawn. "Everyone on the ground! Hands where we can see them!" barked the lead officer. Chaos erupted as the gang scattered, some surrendering immediately while others made futile attempts to escape. Tomas stood frozen in the center, the last remnants of his pride keeping him from dropping to his knees. Two officers approached, their steps deliberate and unwavering. "Tomas Fernandez, you're under arrest," one of them declared, gripping his arm tightly as they forced him to the ground. As the cold steel of handcuffs locked around his wrists, Tomas's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He had envisioned himself untouchable, a figure of fear and power. Now he was just another criminal, stripped of his influence and left to face the consequences of his actions. Outside the warehouse, the gang members who hadn't been arrested lingered in stunned silence. The sight of their leader being taken away shattered the illusion of their invincibility. Conversations began to stir among them, voices laced with uncertainty. One by one, they drifted apart, unwilling to risk the wrath of law enforcement or the ghosts of Tomas's legacy. By the time the police cars disappeared into the night, the gang had all but dissolved. The streets, once echoing with Tomas's name, now stood silent, his reign reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered among the shadows. The morning sun painted the neighborhood in hues of gold, casting a serene glow over the once scarred streets. Children laughed as they ran through the park, their voices carrying a melody of newfound hope. The echoes of fear and despair, once so deeply rooted in the community, had been replaced by something extraordinary: unity. Marco stood at the edge of the revitalized square, his gaze sweeping across the vibrant scene. Where graffiti and debris had dominated, now stood flower beds tended by eager hands. Murals of solidarity adorned walls, telling stories of resilience and courage. A small group gathered near the old fountain, discussing plans to expand the neighborhood's community garden. For the first time in years, people felt empowered to protect their home and each other. "Marcos!" A familiar voice broke through the chatter. Valentina approached, her usual shy demeanor softened by a radiant smile. She clutched a bundle of papers, her fingers fidgeting nervously. "I've been working on something," she said, holding the pages toward him. "It's about you." He took the bundle, his rough hands trembling slightly as he read the title. "The Guardian of the Square." "It's a story," she continued, her cheeks flushing, "about how you inspired us, about how you taught us to fight for what we believe in." Marcos felt his throat tighten. The words on the page were simple yet profound, capturing moments he hadn't realized had left such an impact. Valentina's portrayal of him wasn't just as a protector, but as a symbol of the strength within the community itself. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Just keep being you," she replied, her smile widening. "That's more than enough." The two sat on a nearby bench, watching as life pulsed through the square. The air buzzed with conversations, laughter, and the occasional sound of tools as volunteers continued their efforts to rebuild. Valentina's presence beside him was a reminder of what they had gained. Not just safety, but connection, hope, and a shared determination to preserve what they had fought for. In the weeks following the confrontation, the neighborhood had banded together like never before. People who once avoided eye contact on the streets now worked side by side, organizing patrols, supporting local businesses, and ensuring that every child felt safe playing outside. The transformation was more than physical. It was a rebirth of spirit. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Marcos rose, clutching Valentina's story tightly. "This isn't just my story," he said, his voice steady. "It's ours. Every single one of us who decided to stand up and make a difference." Valentina nodded, her eyes glistening. "But you reminded us that we could." The square grew quiet as twilight set in, yet the glow of hope remained, flickering like a steady flame in the hearts of everyone present. Marcos walked home that night with a renewed sense of purpose. The neighborhood's fight wasn't over, but it was clear they would never face it alone again. This story reminds us that true strength lies not in individual power, but in the ability to bring people together and inspire change. Marcos didn't just protect his neighborhood, he showed them the importance of standing united, proving that even in the darkest times, hope and resilience can triumph. How would you have acted in his shoes? Would you step up to become a beacon of hope for your community? Click the video on your screen to continue your journey of self-discovery and explore more stories that inspire action and reflection. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales and lessons that could spark your next big decision. Together we can learn, grow,